And honestly, given that they're giving people a week in advance heads up that they are going to do that protest on March 1st, I'm guessing that that might end up being the largest scale demonstration yet, targeting the president's top campaign donor, targeting Musk and whatever it is he thinks he's doing to the U.S. government. That one protester who we saw there in California explaining, in that clip from local news, explaining that most of Elon Musk's net worth is tied up in his car company, that is correct. The vast bulk of his wealth is based on his shares in his car company, Tesla. Tesla shares have dropped 20% in value since Inauguration Day. Tesla sales in Europe have taken huge hits recently, down 40 or 50% or more in the largest markets in Europe. Overall, in the last year, globally, electric vehicle sales are up 25%, but Tesla sales are down 1%. And down 1% may not seem like that big a deal, even as the overall market for that type of vehicle is going up. But consider that minus 1% of that drop in Tesla sales this year follows the last 2 years in which Tesla sales were up 38% and up 40%. And now this year they're minus 1. Now, how does that kind of thing affect his ultimate role in what he's doing to our government and what he thinks of his public image, and what he's making the public think of him? I don't know, but I think the most reasonable thing to expect is that it's going to be unpredictable, because I think there's a lot of weird variables at play here. I mean, obviously, this is a personal crusade of his to destroy as much of the constitutional republic as he can, without any regard at all for him having any legitimate government authority or following any laws. The personal dynamic, in addition, between this campaign donor and the president himself is very unusual, given that the president seems to have personally empowered this guy without actually giving him a government job. So the personal dynamic between them is all that Elon Musk has to stand on in terms of what he is doing to our government. The dynamic between them is weird, in which the president is effectively sidelined while Elon Musk takes center stage. The president, in contrast, appears to be weak and sort of beside the point, while his campaign donor regularly upstages him and talks over him, both in interviews and in the Oval Office. I mean, that would be hard to take for even the least egotistical president. It remains to be seen how we'll play out with this one. Along those lines, I have to say, this is also very strange, late-breaking news. I'm not quite sure what to do with this at all, but you should know. CNN was first to report today that the Trump administration has made an unusual decision with regard to Elon Musk's phalanx of private personal bodyguards. Now, NBC has not confirmed this, but CNN is reporting, based on 3 law enforcement sources, that the administration had the U.S. Marshals Service officially deputize members of Elon Musk's team of private bodyguards. And that may sound like kind of a bureaucratic designation, but one practical consequence of that is that the Marshals Service may now allow Musk's team of personal bodyguards to carry weapons on federal property. Loaded weapons. CNN reports, quote, "Some people close to Trump's White House have been taken aback by the scale of security that has surrounded Elon Musk since he became a regular presence in Trump's orbit last year. Musk's security detail rivaled only that of the president himself," the sources observed. But now, with this decision by the U.S. Marshals Service, now Trump and Musk, when they're in the same place, like in the White House or on other federal property, they're both going to be surrounded by equally huge phalanxes of armed guards. One set of them, the Secret Service, presumably loyal to Trump, and the other set, also armed but private and loyal to Musk. But everybody's going to have their weapons? Sure, that's not weird at all. That's definitely not like Monty Python crossed with Shakespeare at all. What could possibly go wrong? Donald Trump has thus far spent 10 of his 31 full days in office at one of his golf clubs. 10 of the 31 days. Donald Trump has not taken a foreign trip since he's been back in the White House. He has signed a grand total of one bill. He has taken an almost cartoonishly outsized interest in posing with big maps that say Gulf of America on them. And although the White House then picked a fight with the Associated Press, trying to force the AP to use that terminology rather than use the Gulf of Mexico, which is what it is, today in an interview when Trump was asked about that, he appeared sort of confused. He didn't seem to even understand that his White House had banned the Associated Press. In fact, saying in an interview today that they could come back whenever they want, even though he's the one who supposedly banned them. I mean, when President Trump isn't playing golf, he has taken multiple meetings about his golf investments. He has gone to the Super Bowl. He had somebody drive him around the track at the Daytona 500. Whee! I literally had him drive around the track. I mean, I'm just going to go out on a limb here and say he is not the busiest man in the world. He appears to be sort of decorative at this point, while the person who's really working double time to make the government actually do things appears to be his top campaign donor, who is getting all the attention and all the credit. And while Trump is, playing race cars and golf and enjoying the worst approval ratings of any new president in the history of polling, and they are getting worse with every passing day, meanwhile, here's just a partial list of the things that Elon Musk and his own companies have somehow reaped from the U.S. government while Trump was, putting. Headline, Justice Department to drop discrimination case against Elon Musk's SpaceX. The Justice Department had filed the case against SpaceX in August 2023, accusing the company of violating federal law and its hiring practices. Yesterday, quote, the Justice Department said it intended to file a notice of dismissal with prejudice, which means prosecutors would not be able to file these charges again. The motion did not say why the case was being dropped. So check that one off his list. Headline, Doge employee cuts fall heavily on agency that regulates Musk's Tesla. A small government team regulating the sort of autonomous cars that Elon Musk says represent the future of Tesla, his car company, is getting cut nearly in half by the Musk-led U.S. Doge service. Check that one off his list. The National Highway Transportation Safety Administration investigation in 2023 led to a recall of 2 million Tesla vehicles. The same agency disclosed in April that it had documented numerous deadly crashes involving Tesla Autopilot. Now, thanks to Elon Musk's Doge, that same agency, the NHTSA, is losing about 10% of its workforce. Check that one off the list. Tesla, I should note, this year plans to put fully autonomous vehicles on the road this year. Yeah, and if you keep gutting the agency that regulates that sort of thing, who'll be there to stop them? Who'll be able to stop them before the crosswalk? Here's another headline. Fate of Rivian's $6.6 billion federal loan now hangs in the balance. Fortune magazine helpfully nuts up the key point at the top of this one. Quote, Georgia Governor Brian Kemp says he does not know whether the Trump administration will honor the contracts of the Biden administration. Quote, if the loan is canceled, Tesla CEO Elon Musk stands to benefit the most. Check Rivian off the list. Who needs that competitor? This comes after the Trump administration already cut off federal funds for the National Electric Vehicle Charging Network, which leaves Elon Musk's Tesla unchallenged as the largest charging network in the country. Never mind that he took huge U.S. government subsidies to build Tesla and to build that charging network. Now that he's done that and he's the biggest game in town, the Trump administration is pulling up the ladder so nobody else can compete with him. Nice work if you can get it. Check that one off the list. The FAA chairman who grounded Musk's Starship rocket program after it catastrophically disintegrated on a botched launch and sprayed debris all over the Caribbean and caused the diversion of dozens of flights. Musk had repeatedly demanded that FAA chair should resign. He resigned on Inauguration Day. And aviation security has been